Welcome. I'm Frank Conkling with Pan Consulting, and this is our ArcGIS Parcel Fabric Workshop. This time we're going to talk about condominiums, and it's going to be a little bit different than normal sort of workshops in which I do a lot of demonstration on here. We're going to talk about just sort of concepts, what condos are, how we historically have handled them, what we might do in the future, and see if there's some experience that we can pull from it right now. It's one of those things where it can be really simple or it can be really complex on it. And it's just, it's an interesting land interest that I know we're all charged with mapping and taking care of. So let's just start with this whole definition of a condominium, or let's even step back further and talk about what is a land interest. And we've talked about in previous workshops that owning land, we say owning land, but owning a real interest in property is really about having a set collection of rights. These rights to use certain things. And with land, it's easy to define what these multiple rights are. You have a right to occupy and to use, you have a right to build on the land, you have a right to grant easements and mortgage and to go and use it for economic purposes, you have a right to restrict what's going to go on there. You have a right to exclude others from doing that and to sell it, refuse to sell it and give it away or abandonment. You have a right to rent it. You have a right to lease it. You have a right to pay taxes on it, which is one of those interesting things. And most of us that are in property appraisers' offices, that's what we're used to mapping. We're used to mapping the areas on which taxes are being assessed and then identifying who's actually going to be paying those taxes. So we map the areas to be assessed or appraised, and then we figure out, well, who's going to pay those, and we set it up so that you have a corresponding tax record in a system of some sort, usually a computer-aided mass appraisal system, a CAMA system, and such. But condominiums are a little bit different in that they don't have all of these rights on them. They rather just have a limited number of rights, and the rights are limited in what they're doing. All right. And there's another reason why when you look at a condominium, for the most part, in most states, you don't find them in plat books, which is what normal simultaneous conveyances are in, for example, subdivisions and certified survey maps up in the upper Midwest. They usually appear in a separate plat book because it's usually larger documents that are getting stored on them to define how this land is being apportioned between them. Condos are different because condos, they define set three-dimensional spaces, and they define the rights, the responsibilities, and the limitations on who can use those spaces. When can they be used? When can they not be used? There's all sorts of limitations on them. What's private to the unit owner, what's semi-private to the unit owner, and what's public meaning the other common owners inside that condominium. So it's a little bit different than standard types of parcel and land interests in property. And it's always caused us to have issues with it because it is a different animal. It's not just a traditional, oh, it's a piece of land and you can identify where that land is. Rather, it is 3D. Some condos are located on ground floor. They're simple, ground floor areas. Others, however, are up further on multiple floors, so they may either be defined as being at a set, floor or a set elevation above ground on them. So again, this is always 3D space that we're dealing with. We're also, definition is that within a condominium, the unit owner doesn't really own the building. The unit owner only owns the finishes, or basically what's commonly referred to as paint to paint, floor to ceiling. The paint that's on the walls, that's the unit owner's responsibility. The wall itself, that's not the unit owner's responsibility. It's the condominium association's responsibility. So it is a little bit different than simple land ownership in which you can build anything. You cannot build in a condominium. The condominium is assumed to be completely built out. You can build and remodel things inside those walls, but you can't move walls around. So with a unit owner, that unit owner has unlimited right to use inside that space that's defined for them. There's still some, I say unlimited, but I mean, really, there is some limitations. They can't go in and install, sometimes they can't go in and install tile flooring because that might disrupt the adjacent owners below them. There's limitations on the amount of things that they can do in there. So there's all sorts of legal constraints placed upon the unit owners inside of a condominium. But then there's other elements in here. For example, inside of here, and you see it over on this exhibit that I have here on the right-hand side, it says LCE for unit number 1. This is a limited common element inside of here in which the unit owner of unit 1 can actually go and access and use what is in essence a balcony. All right. So the unit owner of 1 can go and access and put chairs and things out on that balcony, but only unit 1 owner can actually go and do that. It's still the responsibility of the condo association to maintain it. But the unit 1 owner has that responsibility or has that ability to go out and use that for their own purposes. Same way here with this on this drawing here, there's an LCE for units 2 and 3, which brings out a really interesting point. That's a limited common element, which is shared between 2 unit owners. So as much as we think that parcels are simple, we recognize that there's other variations on ownership, especially condominiums, that are and can be very, very complex. So in addition to the unit owner, which is clearly the space that they can occupy and live in and use, there are the limited common elements, which inside of there that they're usually pertinent to the building and they're part of the building, but the unit owner has that ability to exclusively use those areas for their own purposes, such as these. But then there's also general common elements in here. And in this case, you can see it here. This is a common element here. The common element is those areas that the aggregate unit owners have the ability to go and utilize. Open areas, retention areas, parking areas, maybe underground parking areas. There's all of those common elements. Hallways, lobbies, elevator shafts, emergency stairwells, all of those things, those are all general common elements that anyone that's an owner or has an interest in a condominium then has the ability to go and use those things. So if we think about this, if we're thinking about, well, how do we map out the ownership of those interests in the condominium? That's where it starts getting really complex, because we have single ownership, which is the units. We have semi-private ownership, which is the limited common elements. And then we have a common ownership, which is a proportional ownership for the other general common elements. So there's There's not just the mapping of these, but identification of the fact that there are multiple owners on each of these. Some of them full owners, some of them proportional owners, and there's limitations on them. Condominiums are not simple by any means to do, to the point where when we look at historically what's been happening and how we as cadastral mappers look at this, we've been all over the place. You know, in the beginning, and I've been doing this long enough, I remember that we were very simple. We were just trying to find a way to go and take these polygons that were representing the tax records, because that's really what tax parcels are, finding a way so that we could represent an area included within a polygon, not really dealing with whether or not it was just an individual unit ownership or whether it was limited common elements or general common elements, any of those, just what is a condo? And so it would be very simple. That's where we start down here at this level. And then as we start building this out, we might say, well, maybe we want to more accurately represent the limitations of some of these units, in which maybe we want to have some polygons representing the actual areas in here. And that's where most of us are right now, by the way, is in that sort of focused level. We know that we want to go and map something there, but we're not quite sure how we're going to do it. Then we start moving into this other realm, which says, you know, we should be mapping not just the areas and not just 2D. We should map actually the three-dimensional space for this and differentiate between unit ownership, limited common elements, and general common elements. But then we really get into the complex elements of here. And this is where the more we dig into this, the more we recognize it can really, really get complex in here. And we'll talk about this at the end. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to ask that we sort of join into a discussion and say, okay, what's the best way to do this right now? How do we do it? We're going to talk about what's coming, because we have seen a couple of glimpses at what's coming in there, and talk about whether or not there's better or different software that we might use to do this. I know that some of the people that are on here are representative of organizations that don't have a lot of condominiums. And some of the counties and some of the states even don't have a lot of condominiums. Any place you have population though, you will probably find some condominiums. I can tell you, we have Rebecca on here. Rebecca is from Pinellas County. And I think if I remember correctly, because it's been a while since I've done this, Pinellas County actually has more condominiums than they have parcels. It's just, that's the way it is. I don't think there's any unbuilt land in Pinellas County right now. I think everything is built upon, so that if you want to go and build something, you basically have to tear something else down and build it up again. So there are some counties that don't have to deal with this. Some, this is all they deal with. So there is a lot. So by the way, let's mention this. Chris has already put something over in the chat window. I just want to remind anybody, if you have a question or if you have something you want to talk about, put it over in the chat window and hopefully I'll see it. If not, Chris will go and alert me to the fact that there's something on there. Chris is actually moderating on the chat window, so he'll help with this. And we would like this to be some sort of a general discussion. I don't have the answers on this. This is one where we're setting the groundwork for the future. And we want to understand what we really need to do and what may just be a red herring. We really don't have to do that. But because we can get really intrigued by the technology. There's some amazing technology. But do we have to do that yet? And we don't know. All right. So first thing, And those of you that might have been listening in one of Esri's land records meetup recently, Dan Stone made a reference as a discussion that I had up at Wisconsin Land Information Association a couple of years ago, in which we were talking about condos. And I said, yeah, there's 4 ways to do it. I said, there's tables everywhere. There's tables, or there's breakfast foods. And he was like, that hit home, Frank. So let's talk about tables, because one of the first things that we did when we were looking to find ways to go and relate the tax roll over to the tax parcels was developing some tables on here. But we're not talking about these types of tables, whether it's a console table or picnic table or whatever. We're talking about these tables, all right, in which these are lists of data that we relate to one another. And those relationships can be one record in our polygon feature class is related to one record in a tax roll. In condominiums, for the most part, it wasn't a one-to-one relationship. It was a one record in the polygon feature class would represent all the unit owners in a condominium and all the different variations that there might be some ownership in there. It was a fairly simple way to go and represent condominiums, but there were all sorts of problems with it. One, there really wasn't any geometry with it. It was just, okay, whatever the area of land encompassed in a basic condominium, that's what we're going to represent. And we're never really going to have all of these records in one table. It was always going to be that the tables are related to one another. I can tell you, we have a project in which we collect all 10 million parcels in the state of Florida. And many counties still use this same sort of solution. They have one polygon representing a condominium, and then they have a list of units themselves that are associated with that one condo. So that in reality, we have somewhere around 9.8 million tax parcel polygons in Florida, but we have close to 11 million condominium units and condominium records that are associated with them. So you can see there's some difference there. There's a lot of counties that still use tables on here. And again, normally what they would do is they would have a polygon, and this polygon was often called a header polygon, in which it would represent the overall boundary of that condominium. And then it would be that relationship class, one-to-many relationship class, over to a table of unit owners, sometimes not just the unit owners, sometimes also to the condominium association for those limited common elements and those general common elements in them. And then as we started going through this, we realized that, you know, we had to do a better job to figuring out where these things are located. Not just they don't get spread out all across the condominium, but there's some limitation on there. So at least we could get a one-to-one relationship. And our first attempts at creating these one-to-one relationships was that we would create a single point for every condominium unit. The problem was the condominium units were represented as points, and the areas and land were represented as polygons, so they were different geometries. So it still wouldn't allow us to go and figure out totally the area, but it would give us some general information on where these things are. Sometimes, interestingly, if you come and look at these, sometimes the points are vertically stacked on top of one another, rather than being placed generally on top of where a unit might be, and then sort of stacked for different floors. And I find those very interesting when I run across them. And you can see this here. It has condominiums, but every single one of them is stacked right on top of one another. On ArcGIS Pro, we can go and look at doing some symbology and keying them so that you could see that, oh, you got 24 here. Well, for the most part with ArcMap, we couldn't do that. And you would just have all of these different labels in here. Again, sometimes those unit points were stacked on top of one another. Other times they were scattered, attempting to represent sort of where a unit was or where the buildings were associated with them. We got smarter. So after using points, we started looking at using polygons. For the most part, these were the same geometry types as the parcels. So then we had to try to figure out, well, how do we represent a unit in our GIS tax parcel polygon so that it is in fact representative of a unit? And what this would allow us to do is that when we did our exports out and we gave people information, they would have the same number of polygons as they had tax rolls. So there was that one-to-one relationship, and that was really important. And this seems to be, right now, this seems to be the overwhelming consensus as far as the sweet spot. Here's how you represent condominiums right now. The problem with this is that it really doesn't represent geographically what these limitations are or where they're at. If I go back to, I was on 11 there. If I go back here to this sort of image, you can see that the reason why you want to see sort of where these things are and the limitations on them is that if you look at valuation of these units themselves, as it relates to condominiums, which are usually vertical condominiums, the actual view that they have has a big impact on the actual value of the unit. So if you're looking from an assessment standpoint, from an appraisal standpoint, the view is really, really important. So you want to start thinking, okay, so where is this thing located and what views do they have? And it's very difficult to represent when you're using points on them. So in here, you can see that here, these dark green ones, they are ocean frontage, and the lighter green, and I don't even see them in this one view. You might have golf course and ocean view combined. The blue ones might have ocean view on here. This might be ocean view, golf course view, partial ocean view, garden view, mountain view, or no view. No view here. You know, these are the ones on the end here, and those are sort of how they were valued, was at what level were they and what sort of views do they have on them. So let's keep going. So right now where we're at this point where we're not quite sure how to go and represent these three-dimensional spaces without stopping and spending years in some cases remapping all of these units. How do we do this? So we start talking about some of the complexities of this. If you're going to do polygon representation, how do you do it? This is where we get into breakfast, talking about breakfast, and hopefully everybody, this is late in the afternoon, so hopefully everybody's had enough to eat and thinking about this. But the simplified way of thinking about this is that there are two ways to represent these things. One is with pancakes. One is with waffles. All right. The pancakes are where you take that one primary base geometry, the condominium area, and you just stack them on top of one another. Each one of the pancakes in that stack represents a unit. Again, nice, simple configuration. It provides the one-to-one relationship over to the condominiums. And from that point, you can then at least have the one-to-one relationship. It may not give you everything you need, but it at least is a one-to-one relationship. The other way, the other solution is waffles, in which you create a grid pattern, and each of those grids represents a unit, not necessarily the exact geometry of that unit, but they represent a unit. And each of those grid polygons represents a unit. You have that one-to-one relationship, and you can begin to be a little bit more granular in what you're describing about that property. So you can see whether or not it's on the east side or west side, or whether it has ocean views or parking lot views or whatever it is. Still doesn't represent it 3D, but it still gives you a little bit more granular representation of this. So Chris, do we have any comments yet or any questions?
Nancy has a comment in the chat.
Okay. Nancy says in Michigan. Nancy, why don't you turn on your mic? It's just as easy.
Hey.
Go ahead, Nancy.
So this is really good stuff, Frank. It's a good summary. I just wanted to point out that in Michigan, and I'm not sure if other states or not had it, but we had the concept of land or lot-based condominiums. So the condominium became a type of ownership rather than, I know where your head was. I don't want to distract you.
That's all right. That's all right.
That's really good, you know. So it became kind of like this type of ownership, and then they had the thing that they used to call building condos, which were exactly what you're describing here. So I just want to make people aware that sometimes a subdivision is actually a condominium, you know, but it looks just like a subdivision. And in those cases, it's not so hard for the mapping. And the other thing was that in Philadelphia, it was really weird. They had parcel ID, but then because I guess parking is such an issue in downtown Philly, I suppose, but they had a parking unit and a storage unit sometimes that were attached to the living unit.
Yep.
And so we had two or three non-contiguous polygons, and they wanted to have those have the same parcel identifier, but somehow be able to differentiate, because I suppose there are, you know, better, just as you're saying about the valuation of the view, I suppose there's better parking spaces than others. Living in a small town, I'm not aware of that, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Probably.
So Nancy, these are great points. These are perfect points. And sometimes when I'm talking about things, I talk on such a general level that I forget to get into the details, because I don't want to overwhelm people right away. But you're right. A condominium really doesn't define necessarily a piece of land or even a unit. A condominium is a right to use something. All right. In Florida, we have dock condominiums, where you actually have a right to use a slip in a dock in a marina, and it's a condominium. You buy it and you get the right to use it, but you don't own it. So it's that exact same thing. And then the thing about separation of polygons, it's another reason why there's complexity. In Florida, again, we have these tall buildings. Underneath them are the parking garages. So when you buy a unit, a living unit, you also buy an individual parking space, and there's different valuations on those parking spaces, believe it or not, depending upon what level in the parking garage they are or how far they are away from the elevators. There's all sorts of valuations that go into it. So it's not just the living space that's part of this unit definition, but it's also these other pertinent areas that you get to use. And that sort of introduces the complexity. That, by the way, is part of what I was talking about with that final complexity level. It's like, how do you really do all of this? You're making decisions along the way, recognizing that your mind will explode if you start thinking about all the different permutations of the ways that you represent a right to use something. It's just very, very difficult to get to that point. So great points, Nancy. Thank you. And don't mind jumping in. So let's talk about these pancakes. All right. And again, this seems to be a sweet spot. So we wind up with situations like this, where you have a polygon, a base polygon, and on that base polygon, and if you look over on the right-hand side under the attributes, you'll see there are 20 polygons exactly the same stacked on top of one another on them. All right, they may or may not have attribution as far as what they actually represent. The attribution for this is unit 5A located on floor number 5 or whatever. So it comes down to how much attribution you're going to put in each of these polygons on here, or are you just going to take the parcel number and link it over and store all your attribution in your CAMA system? Again, all sorts of levels of complexity. You know, the Buddhists say there's turtles all the way down. Every time you look, there's a new level of complexity that goes onto these. So the base polygon, again, seems to be the sweet spot right now on how to go and do this. And this, by the way, is an area here in South Florida where you can see the number of units that are attached to these polygons, the number of polygons that stacked on top of one another on there. So this is not a bad representation. Waffles, this is one in which they've actually taken and put a building in there, which is great. They actually went and stored a building. This main area here, common elements. And then they have the individual units represented as one little cell inside that waffle that may or may not represent the actual unit itself, but at least there's a polygon that represents generally where this thing is. Again, we still have to deal with the vertical, but it generally represents that. It still doesn't talk about all the other pertinent stuff. It doesn't talk about parking spaces, doesn't talk about limited common elements, doesn't talk about any of that. Again, just more and more complexity going on here. More turtles as you go on. It's more and more turtles on here. So this is a good representation of how to do this. So what could we do right now before we start talking about in the future? What can we do right now? So we can actually, in the parcel fabric, have stacked parcels in the parcel fabric. All right. Doesn't exactly accurately represent the geometries for the units or the common elements or the limited common elements, but there's that first step up on the complexity scale. It says, okay, we at least are representing a one-to-one representation on here. We know it's not the geometry. We know we're not going to be able to do anything with as far as going and actually looking at views and things like that, but it gives us at least a fairly easy solution. This is one where there's a lot of juice, not so much squeeze. All right, it's a good way to do that. Again, some of them, and you saw this with this waffle definition, they go and they actually, instead of doing the overall base, they actually draw out individual cells or individual polygons on there and they stack those. These are approximations of the unit boundaries. They don't deal with common elements or limited common elements in here, and you can stack them. You can do this inside the parcel fabric. This is actually fairly simple to do. I actually wanted to go and I'll do a demo on here. Before we get into the demo, before we actually started, Rebecca, who's with Pinellas County, was telling me they actually have stacked polygons. Rebecca, can you tell us sort of your experience with that? It's my understanding you're still at the ArcMap parcel fabric. Is that correct? You can unmute yourself. There you go.
That's right. We are still using ArcMap, and we stack the units, but we do a little bit more complex than what you're showing here. We actually use the data from the plats to draw the units as they're platted. At least we attempt to. So they're not just rectangles, unless they're platted as rectangles. They can be pretty curvy or very angular. We also draw the balconies, and we also have to determine the width of the walls to separate out the different units from each other. They're not just all smashed and joined together. There's a gap in between every single unit representing the walls as well.
Wow, I'm impressed, especially considering the amount of condominiums in Pinellas County. So how long did it take you to do that? Or did you have Esri do some of that for you?
The mappers in our department, were compiling the new declarations and plats as they come in. We started this, I think, in 2018.
Yeah.
Any condo that was built prior to that, we did send the data to Esri Canada, and they compiled a lot of it. We've spent the last several years checking their work, so it's a long project, and we've only the Esri Canada condos are only the condos along the coastline. So you know, this is going to be a multi-year, maybe multi-decade project to complete all the condos in the county.
And am I correct? You've got something like 280,000 condos. Is that correct?
I know there's over 2,000 condo complexes.
Right.
I don't know how many
Units.
parcels
Yeah.
we have, but I mean, there's at least 100,000 condo units.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember the work that we were doing over there, that over half of your parcels were condo units on there. So interesting. So let's go ahead, Nancy.
So do you have those timeshare condominiums as well? I mean, and in those cases, you don't try to differentiate each timeshare, right? I mean, it's a single
Correct.
unit with an. Okay.
We have not attempted to do anything like this with the timeshares at this point.
So the timeshare would almost be like a sublease in a sense, right? A person would almost like, okay, never mind. I got it.
Yeah, and which you send the actual tax bill over to the management company, and then they apportion it according to how many weeks somebody owns on which individual units, and the units are usually assessed according to square footage and anything else that might be pertinent to it. So it's all more like an apartment or a lease type thing, where you send it to the management company and they deal with collecting all the taxes on them.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So this is ArcGIS Pro, and this is not going to be anywhere near the complexity of what Rebecca and Pinellas County is doing, but it just wanted to make it a simple sort of demonstration of this. On the left, this is the table of contents over here. This over here is actually a parcel fabric, an ArcGIS parcel fabric that's in here. And those of you that are familiar with the parcel fabric, you'll note what, the standard types of components in here. On the right here, however, I have a local arc scene, which is a three-dimensional view of this data. So this parcel right here actually is, if I go in and do a select on it, it's actually a series of polygons that are stacked on top of one another. All right. In this case, I was lazy and I put exactly the same attribution on it and just copy them. But this is representing pancakes. All right. This is pancakes. And you'll note that since I have this all linked together, as I'm moving this, the 3D view also goes and moves. So as I switch over to my 3D view, I'm actually going to be using my Explorer, which allows me to go and do things like tilt up and move around and such on here. So on here, I can go and see that, in fact, I have individual elements in here. I don't want to go and do anything with my vertices. I don't want that. I do want to go and look at this. So you can see in here that this is, in fact, these stacked polygons on here. Now, if I were to have attributed this with individual floors, in this case, I only put a 10-foot difference between them, but I could put floors in there. So it at least will represent a better component for how this is. This is single plane. It's not an extrusion. It's just a 3D representation of this. And to show you just sort of how this works, I can go back over here to my 2D layer here, and I can build a polygon in here. All right, let me go and create a polygon in here. And let's just create a tax polygon here. All right, and you can see the tax polygon here I just created. Now what I can do is I can do the modify feature, and in here there is a modify which allows me to go and where is it, duplicate vertically. So I can tell it that I want to go and duplicate this with a vertical offset of 20 feet. 20 feet, and I want to go and duplicate it. Yeah. Let's do it 20 times. And you notice on here, that's exactly what it did. I now have 20 parcels here. If I go in here and do a selection and look at my attribution, get rid of this one here, I have 20 plus that initial parcel. So I have 21 parcels in here, and I can attribute every single one of them in the parcel fabric, the 2D parcel fabric. It looks exactly like that. So it's a good representation of this. It's a simple representation, just stacked polygons, just pancakes everywhere. All right. It's a good first step. Not a great one, but a good one. If I wanted to do something a little bit different, I might go in here and say, well, instead of doing that, let's actually create some sort of a unit representation on here. And it just as easily, I can do some sort of a unit representation for this. And I'm not going to get real fancy. I know they can get very fancy in here. All right. Let's go and turn these off. And take that one and do a representation, duplicate vertically of 20 feet, 20 times. There it is here. Let's go and make sure I don't have that layer over here. So let me go and copy this layer here and put it over in my 3D view. All right. Let's turn these off, and you can see there's my unit representation on here. And this is just a 2D plane representation of this as I'm going through here. You know, not a bad representation, but a nice representation of it. Let's go and turn these off. Let's turn these tax parcels back on. Get back to where I want to be. All right, are there any questions about that? I mean, that's a fairly simple representation that we can do on this. It's again, it's not bad. Nice representation on here. I also, however, started looking at, well, what else can we do on here? And there's actually a condo. I've got a separate 3D layer here called condos. All right, and this is more like what Pinellas County is doing, in that you actually have a 3D object, which is being stored and created on here to go and do this. So how do we create a condo in this case? And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a 3D object. And I'm going to draw. And I'm just going to use a simple one here.
Frank, Heather has a question in the chat when you have a moment.
All right.
Are
Go
all the
ahead.
stacked parcels joined in the parcel fabric so that if a least squares adjustment is applied, all vertical shapes will be adjusted?
Yes.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, that is correct. So let me go in here and edit these vertices and get in here a little bit closer. And let me go and just pull this vertically. And you can see that now, once I pull this vertically, I can now go and start exploring this. Let me go make sure I don't. So I have this space in here. I could then go and take that and select it and copy that and paste it. And then pull that up vertically and put that there. So I can go and have vertical alignment between there. And this is where, remember, I talked about turtles all the way down. As we do this, as we go through this, we begin to get more and more complexity because now, okay, when we look at this, this is the standard type of condo. You have the units here. All right. You have, this is the hallway. This is the stairway and the elevators. All right. So there's your common elements inside on this one floor. You have balconies here. You have balconies here. Sorry. Balconies here. So those are your limited common elements. And you can see it's rarely square. So if the actual unit limitation, the unit starts here at the doorway, goes down around through here, goes around here, comes to this closet and back, and then it comes back. So these are not square units. These have complexity built into them. And we have to deal with this infrastructure, the space between the units. How do you manage those? And Rebecca's right, that you have to make sure, because that's the condominium association's responsibility. It's not the individual unit owner's responsibility. The unit owner should only get taxed for the unit space. All right. So just a simple one, you've got to look at not just the overall unit, but the space between the units. And then you start looking at 3 dimensions and non-contiguous parcels in here and multi-story condominiums. This is a really simple condo, but it's actually 2 stories. You've got the lower level here. And then you've got over here, you've got another level. Sorry, you've got another level here, that upper level, lower level on here. So this is a 2-story condominium. It just gets more and more complex on here. So the question is, how do we do this? What are we going to do with this? Where is our sweet spot right now? I can tell you that this is our May 2021 ArcGIS Pro Roadmap. Esri is working on this right now. And they've got it spec'd out and they've got quite a bit of work done on it. I can tell you from what I know, and I'm not disclosing anything that shouldn't be out there, but they're going to be using 3D objects for this 3D cadastre. Well, it turns out that inside of, from an internal structure standpoint, they're not stored in the parcel fabric. It's stored external. So it's a linkage again to a representation of that unit. I can't wait to see what is suggested here for us. I see there's another, Chris, there's another chat on here. Are all the stacked windows joined in the parcel fabric so that if at least, okay, yeah.
We already read that one.
Sorry. Yeah, Heather, because of the way it's dealing with topology, yeah, as we move or adjust any one of those corners, the lines and polygons associated with those corners are moved. Just sort of to demonstrate real quickly, if I go back here and I go back to this area here, you know, as I go and select this, oh, sorry, let's select this and select this. As I go in here and edit vertices, all right. As I go in here, let me see here. Let's not use that one. Let's use this one here. As I go in here and select, it's out of here. All right, as I go in here and move, I don't want to do that. I want to select and I want to move that point. As I go and move this point. All right, just make sure I have some topology on here. Okay. As I go and move this point. All right. Everything else moves. So just to show, Heather, it's exactly how it works. So as these points move, those corners move, and all the representations move on it. So, but again, as you start getting into more and more complex structures, how are you going to do it? Like I said, I'm pins and needles. I want to see what Esri's going to do with this. I think this is a real question, a real challenge on here. But then the question becomes, well, if you're doing 3D objects, should it be in the parcel fabric? Should we continue to make that structure more complex? Or do we use something like ArcGIS Indoors, in which they're doing their own 3D objects, the relationship between them, and should we really be using that to go and model buildings, model indoor spaces within these buildings, so we can represent the common elements, the limited common elements, the units themselves? Maybe that's a better tool for us sometimes to go and do this. Or maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's, you know, building information models, a BIM. This is a BIM here, and this represents all the various components of that 3D building on here. Maybe that's the one. Or there's terminology going around, and Nancy and I were talking about this yesterday, digital twins. A digital twin is a representation of a physical element out there. And it's an old concept, new terminology. It basically just means that you have modeled everything that's important about that. Digital twins are getting a lot of read as it relates to management and maintenance and engineering of buildings because of all the complex infrastructure inside of them. But that same concept can be applied to condominiums. So in the future, maybe it's not the parcel fabric, maybe it's someplace else that's on here. But more importantly, here's the question. What is the rate of return on what we're doing? What is, one of my favorite expressions, is the juice worth the squeeze? There's a lot of effort to put into those. Is it worth it for some of us to go and looking at these 3D models for our condominiums? And if we do go to all that expense and time and resources, is that data applicable to other departments? So I would like to just go and open up the mics. I mean, we're close to an hour, but let's go and get some discussion going on. Nancy, I know you and I started this yesterday, talking about, so maybe there's some value in creating these 3D models of condominium buildings, and these are private buildings, but at the same time, there's a lot of community interest in what they are. When you think about things like what happened down at Surfside here in Miami, but things like pre-incident profiles for fire departments and emergency management, so that these 3D models can represent where are the emergency entrances, how do I get to a certain building or a certain unit inside of a building. So Nancy, I'll stop talking for a minute. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about we have these buildings that have a condominium ownership on them. And as you've described, the complexities of all of that and mapping all of that. But, to counterbalance that, the question is, how are we going to use the resulting graphics and the resulting database? So are we going to give information to the fire and police as to best entrance to enter the building or best place to park to respond to an incident, and alternate approaches to a unit if one entrance is blocked, like for a fire department or a police action, and that might require a different kind of mapping than do we want to create some structural schematics for an assessor to be able to do comparable sales and to be able to compare one unit to another? Or perhaps we want to manage building permits. Perhaps within the condominium building, there's an ability to purchase 2 units and knock out a wall and merge it into a single unit. And maybe that needs a building permit. I don't know. Not that.
That happens all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's, and then we need some way to manage that. And then can a unit have multiple stairs? I mean, I've heard of condominium units that are, first and second floor, but it's all one unit. But I think we need to think carefully, like, because we could drop off a cliff here, right? I mean, how much effort is it going to take to get into this? Now with the new tech, it's obviously a different level of commitment than with the old tech, but because I think the new tech is going to be a lot easier to deploy, and I think it's going to provide some nice graphics, but still, I always caution. Now, Rebecca's issue, I mean, we're, so 70% of your tax base is in condominiums. That's a different question than in Pendleton. I think we have 1 condominium, so it's a different issue, right? So, I mean, depends on the volume that you have and how much they're used and what departments are using them and how frequently they use them. You've touched on that, right? Like, what is the balance of the commitment in a BIM, a building information management system, versus a parcel map versus, supporting tax and assessment and address assignment versus emergency response, building inspection, permitting, all the other things that come along with that.
And it comes down to each individual county in that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And city even probably, right? Like even within a county, maybe one city has that issue. I don't know. I mean, I assume it can vary across the county.
It can be that in more rural counties, you're really, when we say condominium, you may be talking about townhouse condominiums where basically it's just a building, that's your condominium. So that it's just a different type of ownership of what traditionally would just be called a duplex or a townhouse, and then they redistribute the responsibility for maintenance around there. So these different types of condominiums, each of them are going to require rethinking how we actually are going to map these things and how we're going to manage these things, and how much of a commitment is it going to take for us to really model it, and then what's the rate of return? Are we going to be able to use this for more than just one? We want to be really careful when we're moving forward on this and make sure that we really understand not just the overall cost, but the overall return, how critical is that, and what's it going to take to keep it up all the time? Yeah.
Well, that maintenance is a really important issue too, I think, to consider, because you might be able to construct it, but then it seems to me that we're having some staffing issues at a lot of these GIS offices. And so perhaps, a person can do it right now, but then, that person moves on to bigger and greater things. And then now when the next person comes in, they need a skill set to be able to maintain what was laid down initially. And that, I'm not discouraging anybody from trying some of these things and seeing what happens, but just, it's just, like you said, Frank, the rate of return, right?
I think it comes down to this up here and that right here. Where are we going to go along that spectrum of complexity? Some of this stuff is real simple to do. Some of this, it takes almost minimal effort. You go and take your polygons, you stack them on top of one another. It's a good way of representing that you've got 3D elements inside of here. Maybe it's not completely accurate for the actual area, but it brings that into it. It helps you to move along this whole spectrum of getting it. I can share with you, we're talking about condominiums now, but one of the things we haven't talked a whole lot about is this whole concept of when we are mapping for tax purposes, how well are we mapping all of these land interests in the area that's in our county? I can tell you right now, Chris is doing a project in which he's dealing with easements, in which he's mapping the easements located within the subdivisions within a county. And he's already had some areas where these are really aerial easements. These are space easements where it's near an airport and no one can build above a certain thing. So we're suddenly getting into 3D, three-dimensional space easements above and beyond just what you normally would think of as being utility or drainage easements. There's as we start expanding beyond just mapping someone's interest in land that they might be able to be taxed for, we get into levels of complexity, and we want to make sure that we think about this and really we have some good discussions about what's the best way to handle this, because we can go down that rabbit hole. And as I've said a couple times, there's turtles all the way down, and each one of them gets more complex as we step down them. So we just want to be careful with that. All right, listen, I thank everybody who was here. This was great.
Thanks, Frank. That was nice. That's a nice summary of the topic. I thought that was very well put together. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to go and close this, and hopefully everybody enjoyed this. So I'm going to stop the recording.